Let me take you back to Wall Street in the late 1980s, a chaotic, fast paced world driven by high risk, high reward, and often low morals. This was the era of junk bonds, shoulder pads, and a rising class of young brokers who believed they were untouchable. In that storm of ambition, greed, and speculation was a man named Jordan Belfort, a man who would go from humble beginnings to the epicenter of one of the most brazen financial frauds in American history. Jordan was born in 1962 in the Bronx and raised in Bayside, Queens, a working class neighborhood in New York City. He wasn't born into wealth, his parents were accountants, middle class, educated, and practical. But Jordan's ambitions were anything but modest. He had a gift for persuasion and an intense drive to get rich and get rich fast. That brings us to his first real hustle. This was selling meat and seafood out of the back of a truck. No joke, Jordan and a friend launched a door to door meat business that reportedly sold over $70,000 worth of product in a few short months. But the business eventually collapsed under poor management and expansion that outpaced revenue. However, that failure didn't deter him, it redirected him. Jordan then enrolled in a trading program at LF Rothschild, a respected Wall Street investment bank. This is where he got his first taste of the real financial world. The cold calls, the commission checks, and the intoxicating rush of convincing someone to buy a stock over the phone. He was just 22. But just as quickly as he entered the world of high finance, he was forced out. The stock market crash of 1987, known as Black Monday, led to massive layoffs across the industry, and Belfort was one of the many people who found themselves jobless overnight. So what are you supposed to do when you're young, hungry, and locked out of the old boys club? You start your own. In 1989, Jordan Belfort and his partner Danny Porush opened their own firm, Stratton Oakmont. Despite its regal-sounding name, Stratton Oakmont was not a traditional Wall Street firm. They operated in the so-called over-the-counter market, the Wild West of securities trading, where rules were just, let's say, flexible. They focused on penny stocks, low-priced shares from smaller unknown companies. The goal here was to manipulate stock prices through aggressive sales tactics, which at first might have looked like enthusiasm, but we'll get to that. To understand the scheme, you need to understand what penny stocks are. These are shares of companies that are traded on major exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange. They're often unregulated, illiquid, and extremely volatile, which makes them perfect for market manipulation, and Stratton Oakmont was about to make that manipulation into a business model. Inside Stratton Oakmont's boiler room, a term used to describe aggressive sales offices, hundreds of young, often inexperienced brokers were trained to read from scripts and use psychological pressure to convince people to buy stocks. Most of the investors they targeted were middle-class Americans who didn't fully understand what they were buying. And unfortunately, it worked. At its peak, Stratton Oakmont employed more than 1,000 people and managed more than $1 billion in capital. It underwrote the initial public offering, or IPO, for over 35 companies, including the now famous Steve Madden Shoe Company. Belfort made tens of millions, all while claiming to help people invest smartly. But underneath the surface, this was a house of cards, and the collapse would be spectacular. Now that Stratton Oakmont was up and running, Jordan Belfort had a plan, a very illegal one. He was going to use his army of phone jockeys to artificially inflate stock prices, sell his shares at a massive profit, and then leave unsuspecting investors holding the bag. This wasn't just aggressive salesmanship, it was a textbook pump and dump scheme, one of the oldest tricks in financial fraud. So let's break this down because this is the part most people don't really understand. So here's how a pump and dump works. Step 1, Belfort and his firm would secretly acquire large amounts of stock in small unknown companies, usually companies with low trading volume. These were cheap shares, sometimes less than $1 per unit. Step 2, the brokers at Stratton Oakmont would start calling potential investors across the country using well-rehearsed scripts to push these stocks. They'd lie, exaggerating a company's success, claiming insider knowledge and promising huge returns. None of it was true. Step 3, as more people bought in, the stock price would rise, not because the company was doing well, but because artificial demand was created by Stratton's own brokers. This is the pump. Step 4, when the price hit a peak, Belfort and his insiders would unload their shares, cashing out with millions. The moment they sold off, the price would crash. The demand was never real, and there was no one left to buy. Step 5, the average investor, often retired people, small business owners, or first-time traders, were left with worthless stock. That's the dump. If it sounds like a scam, it's because it is, and Stratton Oakmont ran the scam repeatedly, over and over again. They didn't just make a little money, they made hundreds of millions of dollars. And it was no accident. According to federal court records in SEC v. Stratton Oakmont, Belfort and his executives structured the entire firm around these fraudulent sales. Their brokers were trained to deceive, taught how to overcome objections, manipulate fear, and push clients into can't miss opportunities that were actually worthless. This wasn't about investing at all. It was about extraction, about bleeding as much cash as possible from clients before moving on to the next. And the thing is, they covered their tracks. Stratton Oakmont wasn't publicly saying they owned shares in the stocks they were pumping. In fact, they often used offshore accounts and fake nominees to hide their involvement in these companies. That way, no one could trace that fraud back to Belfort or his inner circle, or at least not at first. All of this fraud funded Belfort's new lifestyle. He bought a 167-foot yacht once owned by Coco Chanel. He purchased multiple sports cars, a mansion on Long Island, and flew in private helicopters. The money just flowed like water. But there's something even darker at play here because Stratton Oakmont didn't just sell bogus stocks, they created them. One of the most notorious examples was the Steve Madden IPO in 1993. Belfort's firm helped take the shoe company public, and while investors thought they were buying into a promising new brand, Stratton insiders were secretly holding large blocks of the stock, which they dumped as soon as the prices surged. According to Belfort's own statements and subsequent court records, he and his team made over $23 million from that IPO alone. Steve Madden, the founder of the company, was later convicted himself for securities fraud and money laundering in connection with this deal. By this point, Stratton Oakmont was operating like a casino where the house always wins because the house rigged the game. The victims, everyday Americans, retirees who lost their savings, parents saving for college, small-time investors who trusted a charming voice on the other end of the phone. And the worst part, most of them never got their money back. Belfort's house of cards was about to get some serious attention from regulators and law enforcement. Stratton Oakmont wasn't just a financial crime machine, it was a playground for degeneracy, debauchery, and unhinged ego. The money that poured in from Jordan Belfort's pump and dump schemes didn't go to building a legacy, it went to funding the most outrageous lifestyle on Wall Street. And Belfort wasn't shy about it at all. He bought a 10,000 square foot mansion in Old Brookville, Long Island, and he had a garage full of exotic sports cars, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, and he chartered private jets like most people book Ubers. But what truly defined the culture of Stratton Oakmont was excess, not just in spending, but in behavior. Belfort basically turned his office into a frat house, as the U.S. District Court would later note in the United States v. Belfort, Stratton Oakmont promoted a culture of indulgence, recklessness, and open defiance of ethical constraints. Belfort himself was addicted to Quaaludes, a sedative, hypnotic substance that was commonly abused in the 1970s and 80s. By the time he was running Stratton, he was taking as many as 20 pills a day. He even had a personal dealer on his payroll. In his own memoir, The Wolf of Wall Street, Belfort described one night when he crashed his Lamborghini while high on ludes, then crawled into his house without the use of his legs. He thought he had driven home safely, only to see security footage the next morning showing him crashing into everything in sight. The illicit substances weren't just a personal vice, they were institutional. Belfort encouraged employees to party. If you were a top seller, you got bonuses, illicit substances, and more. The line between incentive and addiction was completely blurred, and that was on purpose. Stratton Oakmont basically became a magnet for degenerates who wanted to get rich and party at the same time. There was little accountability and zero professionalism. Brokers were told to break the law, lie to clients, and keep pushing stocks no matter what. One former employee told federal prosecutors that Belfort used intimidation, manipulation, and threats to keep his staff compliant. Those who questioned orders were fired. Those who played along got rich for a while. Beyond the substances and parties, the firm also routinely falsified documents. They forged signatures, they withheld account statements, they created phony reports that made it look like clients were making money when they were actually being drained dry. According to the court documents from the SEC's 1996 civil suit, Stratton Oakmont brokers routinely engaged in misrepresentation, unauthorized trading, and other deceptive practices. Belfort knew this couldn't last forever, but rather than pull back, he leaned in. He started laundering money, millions of dollars through Swiss banks, using friends, family members, and even his wife's aunt to carry stacks of cash in suitcases across the Atlantic. Yes, literally in cash, smuggled on airplanes. This is how bold he got. He thought he was invincible. But even wolves leave tracks. By 1996, the National Association of Securities Dealers, now known as FINRA, had launched an investigation. And while Belfort was throwing parties, federal agents were quietly watching everything. Here's where wiretaps come into play. A mole inside Stratton Oakmont began recording phone calls. The Securities and Exchange Commission had already sued the firm, but now the FBI had something far more dangerous, and that was insiders. Belfort's days of untouchable greed were numbered. By the mid 1990s, Jordan Belfort's empire looked unstoppable. Stratton Oakmont had made him a multimillionaire. He was living in a drug fueled fantasy life that seemed invincible. But federal agents were quietly preparing a case that would turn that fantasy into a nightmare. The first crack came from the National Association of Securities Dealers. This regulatory body, now known as FINRA, began auditing Stratton Oakmont in the early 1990s. What they found was damning, systematic fraud, unauthorized trades, and widespread deception. In 1994, the SEC filed a civil suit against the firm, stating in court filings that Stratton Oakmont was engaged in a pattern of fraudulent conduct. They accused Belfort and his top executives of intentionally manipulating stock prices for personal gain. The firm agreed to a settlement paying over $2.5 million in penalties, but the damage was already done. Not just to investors, but to Belfort's image. Regulators now had their eyes locked on him. Behind the scenes, the FBI began building a criminal case, and a big key to that case was a man named Steve Madden. Yes, that's Steve Madden, the shoe designer. Steve Madden had ties to Belfort. Stratton Oakmont helped take his company public in 1993, but federal investigators soon uncovered that the IPO had been manipulated. Belfort had hidden his stake in the company, coordinated illegal stock sales, and laundered millions in proceeds from that deal. This would later result in Madden's own arrest and conviction, but his case opened the door for a deeper dive into Stratton's offshore operations. Much of the money Belfort made, upwards of $100 million, had been stashed in Swiss bank accounts. The laundering process was primitive but effective. Belfort would have had his friends, family, and even his in-laws fly to Switzerland with cash in suitcases. These Smurfs, as they were called in court documents, would deposit the money into accounts under false names. In United States versus Belfort, prosecutors alleged multiple counts of money laundering tied directly to these offshore accounts. But it wasn't just the paper trail. The FBI needed witnesses, people on the inside who would flip. One of Belfort's closest associates, Danny Porush, his real-life business partner, and the man portrayed by Jonah Hill in The Wolf of Wall Street, was already under pressure. Federal agents targeted Porush with multiple charges of securities fraud and conspiracy. The walls were closing in fast. By 1998, Belfort was indicted on multiple federal charges, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. But rather than fight it, he cut a deal. Facing decades in prison, Jordan Belfort agreed to cooperate with the feds. He flipped. He turned over evidence against nearly a dozen former friends and employees, including Danny Porush, in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was a calculated decision. Belfort avoided a high-profile trade. He avoided a life sentence, and he knew one thing above all. The feds wanted the bigger fish, and he could help fry them. Dozens of Stratton Oakmont employees would eventually be indicted. Many served time in federal prison. Some, like Porush, cooperated themselves, but Belfort's cooperation sealed his fate as both a criminal and an opportunist. On September 24, 2003, Jordan Belfort was sentenced to 48 months in federal prison and ordered to pay $110.4 million in restitution to victims. He served just 22 months in a California federal prison camp. The wolf was now caged, but only for a while. Now, this is very important. We're going to explore what happened after his prison sentence, how Belfort reinvented himself as a motivational speaker, wrote best-selling books, and somehow managed to turn his criminal past into a brand. At the time of sentencing, he was ordered to pay $110.4 million in restitution to the victims, the vast majority of whom had still seen no compensation. You'd think that would be the end of the story, but it wasn't. Instead of retreating from the public eye, Belfort did what he did best. He sold a story. Within months of his release, Belfort began writing a memoir, a 500-page tell-all titled The Wolf of Wall Street. It was crude, over-the-top, unapologetically indulgent, and widely popular. Published in 2007 by Random House, the book became a bestseller, offering readers an inside look at the debauchery of Stratton Oakmont. But here's the twist. Instead of being reviled as a con man, Belfort became a celebrity. He gave interviews, went on book tours, and even launched a second memoir, Catching the Wolf of Wall Street, detailing his arrest and prison sentence. Then, in 2013, Hollywood came calling. Martin Scorsese directed The Wolf of Wall Street, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. The film was a massive success, grossing nearly $400 million worldwide and earning 5 Academy Award nominations. DiCaprio's portrayal was electric, charming, and chaotic, much like the man himself. But critics raised a very serious question. Was the movie glamorizing fraud? Was it turning a man who destroyed lives into a pop culture icon? Who knows? While some saw Belfort as a cautionary tale, others saw opportunity. After prison, Belfort pivoted into a new career, motivational speaking. He started giving seminars around the world on sales mastery, ethics, and entrepreneurship. Tickets for his straight line persuasion system sold for thousands of dollars per person. He built a personal brand, not as a criminal, but as a quote unquote reformed hustler who had learned from his mistakes. He claimed he was teaching people how to avoid the traps that destroyed him. But the truth here was way more complicated. By 2013, government records showed that Belfort had paid back less than 10% of the $110 million owed to his victims. He was living comfortably in California, earning millions from books and speaking engagements, while many of the people he defrauded were still rebuilding their lives. In a letter filed with the court that same year, prosecutors accused Belfort of dragging his feet and minimizing restitution, even while profiting from his crimes. Belfort responded by claiming he had paid back over 50% of what he owed, a number widely disputed and unsupported by DOJ records. The truth, his earnings were difficult to track, filtered through corporations he created after prison. Today, Jordan Belfort continues to market himself as a self-help guru and sales expert. He hosts a podcast, he sells online coaching, he appears at business summits, and gives keynote speeches around the world. He's built a new fortune, and all while the wreckage of his old one is still very much real for his victims. So was it redemption, or was it just a rebrand? Moving on here, we should reflect on the legacy of Jordan Belfort. What can we learn from his story, and how should society handle white-collar criminals who manage to turn their downfall into fame? Jordan Belfort's story is more than just a cautionary tale about greed. It's a mirror reflecting deeper problems in our financial systems, our legal institutions, and maybe even our culture. Because what does it say about us when someone can commit one of the largest securities frauds of the 1990s, leave thousands of victims in financial ruin, serve less than 2 years in prison, and then emerge with a movie deal, book royalties, and a global speaking career? Let's just call a spade a spade. Jordan Belfort was never some harmless party boy with too much money and too little self-control. He was an architect of a complex financial scam that targeted ordinary people, retirees, first-time investors, small business owners, and his actions didn't just lose them money, they lost savings, homes, and in some cases, their trust in the financial system forever. In his 1999 indictment, federal prosecutors made it clear Belfort's crimes were premeditated, coordinated, and fueled by a toxic mix of arrogance and opportunism. He wasn't just breaking the rules, he was rewriting them for his own benefit. And yet, through charisma and storytelling, Belfort recast himself not as the villain, but as a reformed anti-hero, a slick-talking motivational speaker, a brand. Here's the problem. White-collar crime rarely gets the same treatment as violent crime. According to a 2017 study by the U.S. Sentencing Commission, the average sentence for federal fraud was just under 2 years, even for schemes involving millions of dollars. Belfort's sentence in question? 48 months cut in half for good behavior and cooperation. No barbed wire, no maximum security. He served his time in a minimum security camp, often nicknamed Club Fed. Meanwhile, victims of Stratton Oakmont, some of whom were interviewed by ABC News and other outlets, say they've only received pennies on the dollar in restitution. Some received nothing at all. As of the most recent publicly available records, Belfort still owes tens of millions of dollars to the people he defrauded. While he claims he's paying it back through his speaking fees, there's no legal mechanism that compels him to allocate most of that money to restitution. So what do we do with this story? Do we treat it as entertainment, a Hollywood drama where the bad guy makes us laugh and the victims fade into the background? Or do we see it for what it really is? A deep flaw in how we respond to financial fraud, a system where charisma can outweigh consequence. Because Belfort is not unique, he's just the most famous. Every few years, another Jordan Belfort comes along, someone who finds a loophole, exploits trust, and walks away richer than ever before. We can't always stop fraud, but we can decide how we respond to it, how we punish it, how we remember it, and who we choose to celebrate. In the end of the story of the Wolf of Wall Street, it's not about redemption, it's about reputation. It's about how far charm, money, and privilege can take you in a system that's all too often rigged, not just against investors, but against accountability itself. And it's about us, the viewers, the consumers, the people who actually decide whether we turn a criminal into a celebrity. So next time you see someone wearing a Wolf of Wall Street shirt or quoting his sales advice, ask yourself, is that a lesson in success or a warning we've already ignored?